We've already seen a couple of these examples. There was the idea that the universe could have only be one of a multiple infinite number of universes, but there's not a single observation that would lead one to such a conclusion. And then there's the idea that the universe just sprang from nothing, but there wasn't a single observation that would lead one to that conclusion either. Like the young boy in our story, there's not anything that anyone has observed to lead us to conclude that these things happen. Here's another example. You saw a moment ago how DNA resembles a highly specified language or code. However, a very popular view today is that this code formed itself through natural biological processes called random mutation and natural selection, aka evolution. So you would think with such a popular view that there must be some good observable evidence to draw such a conclusion. What I'm about to say may come as a shock to some of you and maybe even cause you to tune me out. But all I ask is, since it came this far, would you at least hear me out for just a couple of minutes longer?
There's really only two possible explanations for the origins of life. Either formed through natural processes or formed by an intelligent source. If an intelligent source formed all life, he'd have done it so that it could function well together in this one biosphere we call Earth. This means that we would expect to observe two things as evidence for an intelligent designer. First, we would expect to find that many of the different life forms possess similar features, sort of how automobiles have round wheels and motors. Secondly, we would expect to find that key component to detecting intelligence, specificity. On the other hand, if life were the product of natural unguided processes from a single primitive organism to multiple advanced life, we likewise would also expect to observe that many of the different life forms possess similar features. We secondly would expect to observe this process at work, if not in the fossil record, at least in the biology laboratory. Notice here how both theories expect similar features to exist among the various life forms. Whenever the same evidence is expected by two differing views, then that particular evidence can no longer be used to weigh in on the issue. This is what we call polysemic evidence, and it must be thrown out. In the famous Robert Blake murder trial, where he was accused of shooting his wife, the prosecutors claimed that gunshot residue on Blake's hands and clothes was evidence of his guilt. This is because whenever a gun is fired, it is known to expend trace amounts of primer residue in all directions. However, his defense attorney also argued that it has been proven that gunshot residue is often transferred onto the hands and clothes by other means, especially to gun owners by their own personal gun.
So if somebody has those primer residues on their hands, they may have some questions to answer. It tells you four things. Basically, one would be if a shooter fired a gun, or if they were in the general vicinity of a gun being fired, or if they picked up a gun that had recently been fired. And the last is it could be contamination from, say, if they had gotten in the back of a police car or something like that.
Since Blake was a handgun owner, he would then be expected to have other logical explanations for the presence of gunshot residue on his hands and clothes and still be innocent. This rendered the gunshot residue evidence polysemic and useless in proving his innocence or guilt. Other stronger evidence was required. Likewise, since both theories on the origins of life expect similarity between the differing life forms, we must therefore eliminate that particular evidence from the issue. Other stronger evidence is required. That means to prove intelligent design, we must observe highly specified features in life. And to prove evolution, we must observe the actual process happen in either the fossils or the lab. Here comes the part that I said may shock you. When it comes to the idea of unguided evolution, we simply do not observe a single example of either that shows this process at work. None. In the fossil record, there is not one example of a finely graduated chain from one major form to another. Not one single such chain exists. All evolutionary arguments from the fossil record rely on similarities between the different forms. But again, similarity cannot be used to resolve this issue. Evolution theory says that life evolved through random mutations in the DNA during reproduction, and then those mutations, which gave the organism an advantage, were selected by natural environmental conditions to survive. Over millions of years, new and more advanced life forms emerged from this process. This means a whole lot of new information being added to the DNA code over time. The only way to show that this process did happen using the fossil record would be to produce at least one example of a finely graduated chain. I can't overemphasize the phrase finely graduated here enough. This is because evolutionists often complain that when they do present chains of evidence, that intelligent design proponents simply require more links between their links. However, this is only because what evolutionists are calling a chain is not at all a finely graduated chain. What they are doing is linking two different types of creatures together using similarity arguments and calling it a chain. But it's really only an argument from similarity. A true finely graduated chain would be one in which there was no sudden leaps from one creature with legs to one with fins, or from a dinosaur with no sail to a huge sail. Just scaling the language barrier between intelligent design and evolution can sometimes be an art in itself. The point here is that there's no such finely graduated chain in existence, and almost all respectable paleontologists will admit to this fact.
Darwin himself acknowledged the lack of transitional fossils in the rock strata. Darwin wrote, "Intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this perhaps is the most obvious and serious objection which can be urged against the theory."
The key problem with Darwinism is finding hard physical evidence. Where would you look for that evidence? Well, obviously in the rocks, in the record of the rocks, the fossil record. Fossils have been collected for hundreds of years, for centuries. There are billions of fossils in every university and every museum in the world. But there are no intermediate species. You look at one strata and you find one kind of fossil. You look at the strata above it, you find a different kind of fossil. What you don't find is a gradual change.
Again, I want to reiterate here that you don't have to have great wisdom and knowledge and be up on all the latest scientific journals about Australopithecus and Ambulosaurus and Tyrannosaurus rex. You don't have to have all these scientific names for fossils floating around in your head and have all this information crammed into your brain to see the simple flaw here. Since there's no finely graduated chains of fossils leading from one major form to another, that's all you need to know. There's no observable evidence from the fossil record that would lead one to conclude that evolution happened. But there is one other place that we might be able to look and see evidence for evolution. If we were to actually observe new information that didn't previously exist being added to the DNA code of a multi-celled organism and giving it a beneficial advantage, that might do it. This will at least demonstrate that there was a process at work that makes the theory feasible. It would require us to observe it under a controlled situation, of course, where we knew for certain that the information did not already exist previously in some small minority of the population. Evolutionists will often cite an organism's ability to adapt to various adverse environments, like an insect becoming immune to pesticides. But upon closer examination, we see that this is not an observation of new genetic information forming, but rather it is already existing genes taking over in the population after the insect's relatives are all killed off. The gene already existed in a small group and was only present in that small few. But when the pesticides eliminated the majority, then that small group was all that was left to repopulate. Similar to how Hitler tried to create his master race. He reasoned that if only blonde-headed, blue-eyed people were around to mate, then they would have blonde-headed, blue-eyed babies. But killing off brunettes and redheads didn't cause blonde genes to form. It merely made already existing blonde genes the predominant ones in that population. Another example that evolutionists will often cite as evidence for added information is found in bacteria. But consider the fact that bacteria are single-celled organisms, which have a special kind of DNA called plasmids, completely unique to almost all other life forms. Bacterial changes that occur in the DNA are a result of outside environmental pressures, not a result of random mutation and natural selection, meaning that they're very specified in the way that they change. It's as though they were designed with the knowledge that they had no ability to migrate, so that they were given a special ability to incorporate novel ways of metabolizing new food sources. That is why only examples of the process at work in multicelled organisms will help in demonstrating evolution. However, to date, no such examples have ever been observed.